July 64 AD, Rome burned. The capital of the greatest empire in the world was engulfed by flames. Smoke blotted out the sky. Heat and ash choked the air. Entire districts crumbled in firestorms that lasted for days. Men, women, and children fled through narrow streets, carrying what little they could save. Temples, markets, and monuments all vanished into smoke. By the time the fire died down, much of Rome was gone. At the center of this story stood one man, Nero, Emperor of Rome. To some, he was a tyrant who watched and played music while his city burned. To others, he was a misunderstood ruler who rushed to provide relief in a moment of disaster. For nearly 2,000 years, historians have debated whether Nero was Rome's villain or its victim. But to understand the fire, we must first understand the Rome that came before the flames, the eternal city before the fire. Rome in the mid-1st century AD was a city of contradictions. It was the jewel of the empire, the heart of Roman power, wealth, and culture. Yet it was also a chaotic, overcrowded, and fragile city. Its population was enormous, with estimates ranging from 500,000 to over 1 million people, the largest city in the ancient world. The grandeur of Rome was undeniable. Aqueducts carrying fresh water, monumental temples, massive amphitheaters, and the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill. But beneath that grandeur, most Romans lived in cramped and dangerous conditions. Narrow alleyways twisted between tall wooden apartment blocks, called insula. These structures often rose several stories high, poorly built and highly flammable. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and crowded markets filled the city with constant fire hazards. Even before Nero, Rome had burned many times. Smaller fires were common and expected, but the conditions of 64 AD were ripe for disaster. Nero's Rome. Nero had been emperor since AD 54, rising to the throne as a teenager after the death of his stepfather, Emperor Claudius. At first, Nero was guided by his mother Agrippina, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Burrus. Those early years were seen as stable and even prosperous. But as Nero grew older, his reign became increasingly controversial. He clashed with the Senate, sidelined traditional aristocratic power, and focused his energy on art, theater, and music. While past emperors had prided themselves on military conquests, Nero performed as an actor and musician, something scandalous for Roman elites. To the common people, Nero was unpredictable, sometimes generous, sponsoring games and public works, other times cruel, accused of extravagance, executions, and even the murder of his own mother. By 64 AD, his reputation was already sharply divided. Some loved him, others despised him, but no one ignored him. A city ripe for disaster. Rome was not only crowded, but also deeply unequal. The wealthy lived in sprawling villas with gardens and courtyards. The poor were crammed into wooden tenements that could collapse at any moment. Streets were so narrow that carts often jammed, and when one building caught fire, the flames could leap easily from rooftop to rooftop. Food shortages and political tension added to the instability. Grain supplies from Egypt and North Africa kept the population alive, but any disruption could trigger riots. Senators resented Nero's growing control, while ordinary Romans depended on him for entertainment, bread, and spectacle. The city itself had outgrown its infrastructure. Aqueducts and sewers strained under the pressure of 1 million residents. Markets bustled with constant activity, but every market stall was also a fire waiting to happen. In this environment, one spark could become a catastrophe, and in July of 64 AD, that spark came. The shadow over Nero. Even before the flames, Nero's relationship with the Senate was uneasy. Many aristocrats believed he disrespected tradition and indulged too much in luxury. His passion for the arts, his public performances, and his vast spending on palaces and games created enemies among the elite. For the people of Rome, Nero was a mixed figure. He provided entertainment and occasionally generous handouts, but his extravagance bred suspicion. Rumors about his role in political murders, including that of his own mother, further tainted his image. So when disaster struck, the city was already primed to blame him. Foreshadowing of the fire. On the eve of the disaster, Rome was tense. Summer was always dangerous. Dry heat, wooden buildings, and crowded markets created the perfect storm for fire. But in 64 AD, whispers of unrest grew louder. Some claimed the gods were angry with Rome. Others believed Nero himself dreamed of reshaping the city to match his vision. A new Rome built in his image, with wide boulevards, stone houses, and a golden palace at its heart. Whether by accident or design, the stage was set. The city was a tinderbox. All it needed was a spark. In July 64 AD, that spark came. The flames began in the Circus Maximus district, where shops and warehouses crowded tightly against one another. No one could have guessed how quickly the fire would spread. The Eternal City, which had stood for centuries, was about to face one of its greatest trials. And at the center of it all stood Nero, emperor, artist, ruler, and, in the eyes of many, a monster. The question that would echo for millennia was about to take shape. Did Nero watch as his city burned, or did he fight to save it? The story of the fire had begun. The aftermath of the Great Fire, the fire that consumed Rome in July of 64 AD, left devastation on a scale almost unimaginable. The flames had raged for 6 days and 7 nights, and even when it seemed that the city had finally been spared, the fire flared up again with renewed fury. By the time the last ember cooled, 2/3 of Rome had been reduced to ash and rubble. Thousands were left homeless. Temples, markets, libraries, and entire districts had disappeared. The psychological scars were just as deep as the physical ones. Rome, the Eternal City, had been humiliated by fire. Survivors staggered through charred streets in disbelief. Families searched for missing loved ones. Men and women stood over the smoldering remains of their homes, clutching what little they had salvaged. Children cried for food and water. For many Romans, it felt as if the gods had turned against them. The fire was not merely a disaster, it was an omen. In the immediate aftermath, Emperor Nero was forced into action. Whatever history would later say about him, in those critical first days he acted decisively to relieve the suffering. Ancient sources describe how Nero opened his private gardens to the homeless, offering them temporary shelter. He ordered grain shipments to be distributed at reduced prices. He even arranged for emergency shelters to be constructed in the open spaces of the Campus Martis and other large areas. For a moment, it seemed as if the emperor was fulfilling his duty as guardian of the Roman people. But relief was not enough. The question hung over the smoldering ruins of the city. How had the fire started? Some whispered it was an accident, the result of a careless spark in the crowded shops of the Circus Maximus. Others, however, whispered darker things. Rumors spread quickly that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his ambitious building projects. Some even claimed they had seen imperial guards preventing people from fighting the flames or driving them back when they tried to save their homes. The most enduring rumor was that Nero had stood upon his palace balcony, or even upon a tower, and watched Rome burn while singing of the destruction of Troy. Tacitus, the Roman historian, cautiously reported the rumor, though he admitted he could not verify it. Suetonius, writing later, repeated it more confidently, portraying Nero as a deranged artist, delighting in the flames. Whether true or not, the story took root in the Roman imagination. To many, Nero was not a protector, but the destroyer of Rome. The rebuilding of the city began almost immediately, and Nero seized the opportunity to reshape Rome according to his vision. Wide new streets were laid out to prevent such devastating fires from spreading again. Height restrictions were imposed on apartment blocks, and brick replaced wood as the primary material for construction. These measures reflected genuine foresight. They also showed Nero's desire to leave his mark permanently on the capital. At the heart of the reconstruction rose a project that would haunt Nero's reputation forever: the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This was no ordinary palace. It was a sprawling complex of halls, gardens, lakes, and banquet rooms adorned with marble, gold leaf, and precious stones. Its most famous feature was a massive rotating dining hall, said to imitate the movements of the heavens. For many Romans, the palace was the ultimate proof that Nero had set fire to Rome, so that he might build his dream residence upon its ashes. The Golden House became a symbol of imperial arrogance and disregard for the suffering of ordinary people. Meanwhile, the emperor's need for a scapegoat became urgent. The people's suspicion of Nero simmered dangerously, and the Senate, never entirely loyal to him, was watching closely. To deflect blame, Nero pointed to a small and unpopular sect that had begun to spread in Rome. The Christians. At this time, Christianity was still a fledgling faith, seen by most Romans as a strange offshoot of Judaism. Its followers rejected the traditional gods, refused to worship the emperor, and often gathered in secret. To many Romans, this secrecy looked suspicious. When Nero accused the Christians of setting the fire, it was easy for many to believe it. The persecution that followed was brutal. Ancient writers describe horrific punishments inflicted on Christians. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were coated in pitch and set alight as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. Tacitus, no Christian himself, was appalled by the cruelty, noting that although the Christians were widely disliked, the sheer savagery of their treatment aroused pity even among the Roman people. This persecution marked one of the first great clashes between the Roman state and Christianity, a conflict that would echo through centuries. For Christians, Nero became the embodiment of tyranny and evil, sometimes even remembered as the Antichrist in early writings. For Rome, the executions provided temporary relief, but the suspicion against Nero never fully disappeared. As months turned into years, the fire and its aftermath continued to define Nero's reign. The emperor's efforts to style himself as an artist rather than a ruler grew more extravagant. He performed in theaters, competed in chariot races, and forced senators and nobles to watch his performances. To many Romans, this behavior seemed grotesque, especially in the shadow of the city's destruction. The Senate, meanwhile, grew restless. The costs of rebuilding Rome and constructing the Golden House strained the treasury. Taxes rose, and discontent spread through the provinces. Rebellions flared in distant corners of the empire. Even the legions, once loyal, began to doubt their emperor. The Great Fire had not only destroyed Rome's buildings, it had also consumed much of Nero's credibility as a ruler. Looking back, historians saw the fire of 64 AD as a turning point. Before the fire, Nero still held the chance to secure his reign through competence and generosity. After the fire, suspicion and resentment hardened into open hostility. His enemies multiplied, and his downfall became inevitable. The blaze that had lit up the night sky over Rome had also ignited the slow-burning fuse of rebellion. The people of Rome, however, could not simply forget. For years afterward, they lived in the rebuilt city, walking streets that had been redesigned according to the emperor's will. They saw the shimmering halls of the Golden House rising from the ruins, and they remembered the smoke and screams of that terrible week. The memory of the fire became entwined forever with the name of Nero. Whether he had started it or not no longer mattered. In the eyes of many Romans, Nero and the fire were inseparable. The Great Fire of Rome became more than a disaster. It became a test of leadership. It revealed the fragility of empire, the fears of the people, and the ambitions of a man who wanted to be more than an emperor. In the ashes, the true nature of Nero's rule was laid bare. Part 3. Nero's Fall and the Legacy of the Fire. The Great Fire of Rome marked a decisive turning point in the reign of Emperor Nero. Before the disaster, his eccentricities and artistic ambitions could be tolerated as the quirks of a young ruler. After the fire, they became intolerable. Suspicion lingered like smoke over the empire, and no amount of rebuilding or public generosity could wash away the belief that Nero had betrayed his people. In the years that followed, Nero's focus shifted further from governance to self-indulgence. He declared himself not only a ruler but a performer, eager to prove his artistic genius on the stage and in the arena. He compelled senators and nobles to attend his performances, forcing the elite of Rome to sit in silence while their emperor sang, acted, and played instruments. Those who failed to applaud with sufficient enthusiasm risked his wrath. The Emperor of Rome had become, in the eyes of many, little more than an entertainer drunk on his own vanity. While Nero played at being an artist, the empire strained under the weight of his policies. The reconstruction of Rome demanded vast sums of money. The construction of the Domus Aurea consumed more still. Taxes increased across the provinces, and resentment festered. Governors faced uprisings, and Rome's grip on its territories weakened. The empire, once stabilized under Augustus and strengthened under emperors like Claudius, now trembled under Nero's extravagance. The Senate, already wary of him, began to see Nero as a liability. Senators remembered the terror of the fire, the suspicion that he had lit it, and the cruelty of the Christian persecutions. They whispered of his incompetence, his arrogance, and his indifference to the suffering of his subjects. A ruler who could not command respect in times of crisis could not endure. Unrest exploded first in the provinces. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, rose in rebellion, calling for the end of Nero's rule. Although Vindex was defeated in battle, his revolt lit a spark that spread to Hispania, Africa, and beyond. The governor of Hispania, Tarraconensis, Servius Sulpicius Galba, declared himself emperor. With the backing of his legions, Rome had entered open rebellion. When news of Galba's challenge reached Rome, Nero panicked. The emperor who once strutted upon the stage now found himself alone, abandoned even by his allies. The Senate, sensing the shifting tides, turned against him. One by one, his guards and servants deserted. The Praetorian Guard, once sworn to defend him, declared their loyalty to Galba. Nero, the master of Rome, was suddenly powerless. In despair, Nero fled the city. He sought refuge in a villa on the outskirts of Rome, accompanied by only a handful of loyal freedmen. There, on June 9, 68 AD, faced with the certainty of execution, Nero chose to end his own life. According to tradition, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, founded by Augustus a century earlier, came to an end. The empire plunged into chaos. Civil war erupted, and in a single year, 4 men would claim the imperial throne in rapid succession. The Year of the Four Emperors was a direct consequence of Nero's failures. The Great Fire had not only scarred Rome's skyline, but also destabilized its political foundations, leaving the empire vulnerable to turmoil. Yet the memory of Nero endured, shaped by both hatred and fascination. For many Romans, he remained the villain who burned his own city and tortured its people. For Christians, he was the archetypal persecutor, the embodiment of evil itself. In the centuries that followed, Nero's name became synonymous with tyranny, extravagance, and cruelty. And yet, there were also whispers of another Nero, one who had once offered shelter to the homeless, reduced the price of grain, and rebuilt Rome with more durable and fire-resistant structures. Some historians of later generations argued that Nero's urban reforms were visionary, that he sought to make Rome safer and more beautiful. But this defense was drowned out by the louder, darker image of Nero as the emperor who fiddled while his city burned. The fire itself became a symbol far larger than the event. It was remembered not merely as a disaster of nature or accident, but as a test of Rome's leadership. Where Augustus had guided the city with patience and order, Nero had failed in the crucible of crisis. His reputation burned with the city, and though new emperors would rise and fall, his ghost haunted the imperial imagination. In the years after Nero's death, rumors spread that he had not truly died. Across the provinces, impostors appeared, claiming to be the emperor returned. These false Neros sparked uprisings and unrest, proving how deeply his presence lingered in the Roman mind. Even his enemies could not forget him. The Great Fire of Rome thus became more than a moment in history. It became a story about power, responsibility, and the fragile bond between ruler and people. Fire could be an accident, but the failure to respond to fire revealed the truth of character. Nero, in his obsession with art, performance, and glory, could not understand the anguish of his citizens. His failure was not simply that he may have caused the fire. His failure was that he allowed suspicion to consume trust, cruelty to overshadow mercy, and vanity to eclipse duty. Rome, however, endured. The city rose from its ashes, stronger in stone and design. Its streets widened, its buildings more secure. The empire outlived Nero, weathered the storms of civil war, and continued for centuries. The fire that seemed to threaten the end of Rome was, in truth, a rebirth. Yet the shadow of Nero lingered. His name was etched forever into the memory of the eternal city. Closing, the story of Nero and the Great Fire of Rome is not merely the tale of a disaster or of one man's downfall. It is the reminder of how fragile trust can be between ruler and people. An emperor's duty is to protect, to rebuild, and to give hope in times of despair. Nero gave some of this, but he gave it too little, too late, and always with the suspicion that it served himself rather than his subjects. When the flames devoured Rome, they also devoured the mask that Nero wore. The artist, the dreamer, the ruler, all were consumed, leaving only the truth of his legacy. A man who might have been remembered for vision, but was condemned for vanity. Rome rose again, but Nero's name was forever marked by fire.